There is a specific phrase that appears in the internal communications of intelligence services, military planning departments, and geopolitical risk firms in the days and weeks before the most consequential developments. In major conflicts, the phrase is not dramatic. It does not sound like a warning. It sounds, if anything, like reassurance. The phrase is, the situation appears stable. And the reason that phrase has become, for the analysts who know what it historically precedes, one of the most reliable indicators of imminent significant development is precisely its reassuring character, because the situations that appear most stable are the situations in which the pressure that has been building beneath the surface has finally reached the level at which it is no longer generating the visible friction that signals instability, and has instead compressed into the specific pre-rupture condition that looks from the outside exactly like calm. That is where this conflict is right now. The experts are starting to see it, the internal conversations are starting to reflect it, and the gap between what the public conversation is processing as managed stability and what the analytical community is beginning to recognize as pre-rupture compression is the most important strategic gap in international affairs at this specific moment. My name is Professor Jiang Xueqin, and if you want to understand what the experts are starting to see, why the calm phase is more dangerous than the active phases that preceded it, and what the realistic consequences look like when the pre-rupture compression finally releases, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now, because this is the analysis that makes the danger of apparent calm visible before the calm ends in the way that pre-rupture compression characteristically ends. In this video, we are going to answer 3 precise questions. What specifically are the experts starting to see that has shifted their assessment of the calm phase from reassuring to alarming? And why does the combination of indicators they are tracking constitute a genuine pre-rupture signal rather than analytical overcaution? Who are the decisive actors whose behavior during the calm phase is generating the indicators that are shifting expert assessment? And what is the real logic driving that behavior beneath the surface of the situation's apparent stability? And from this point forward, what are the realistic scenarios, the path on which the pre-rupture compression releases in, the way that the indicator suggests, and the path on which recognition of the danger produces an intervention adequate to change the trajectory, and the strategic wildcard that could alter the fundamental dynamic before the release occurs. By the end of this video, the calm you've been observing in this conflict will have a completely different character in your analytical framework than it had before you pressed play. Let us begin with the context reset, because the most important analytical task in understanding why the calm phase might be the most dangerous is understanding the specific mechanism through which apparent calm becomes pre-rupture compression, and why that mechanism is so consistently underestimated by the public frameworks that process conflict developments. The intuitive model of conflict progression treats intensity as a reliable indicator of danger. The louder, the more active, the more dramatic the visible conflict, the more dangerous the situation. That model is approximately accurate for the early and middle phases of a major conflict. When the pressure generating the conflict is still being discharged through the visible friction of active competition, it becomes actively misleading in the late phases of a conflict, when the pressure has reached a level that exceeds the capacity of visible friction to discharge it, and the excess pressure is being absorbed into the structural conditions of the situation. Rather than released through the events that the intensity-based model tracks, pre-rupture compression is the condition in which excess pressure is being structurally absorbed rather than visibly discharged. It produces the appearance of reduced intensity precisely because the pressure is no longer finding the release valves that generated visible friction, and the apparent reduction in intensity is therefore a signal of danger rather than reassurance. Here's what has literally just happened that has shifted expert assessment from managed stability to pre-rupture concern. Across the preceding several weeks, a set of indicators has emerged simultaneously in the analytical picture of this conflict that individually falls within the range that the established monitoring frameworks would characterize as within baseline, and that collectively crosses a threshold that the most attentive analysts recognize as the pre-rupture configuration. The first indicator is the systematic closure of the communication channels through which the conflict's escalation pressure has historically been managed. The back-channel contacts, the intelligence-to-intelligence communications, the diplomatic intermediary relationships whose function has been to provide a controlled release mechanism for pressure that would otherwise build to rupture levels. The closure of those channels does not generate a visible event. It generates an absence. The absence of the communications that have historically occurred at this stage of the pressure cycle, and absences are the hardest category of signal for the standard monitoring framework to detect and adequately weight. The second indicator is the specific pattern of resource and capability positioning that reflects preparation for a contingency whose parameters exceed the established framework of the current conflicts managed competition. That preparation is not being publicly acknowledged by any of the actors conducting it. And each individual element of it has a surface-level characterization that places it within the baseline. But the combination of elements, read as an integrated preparation signature, crosses the threshold that the pre-rupture configuration requires. And the third indicator is the specific shift in the decision-making behavior of the key actors, the compression of their consultation cycles, the elevation of the seniority level at which specific operational decisions are being made, and the specific changes in their public communication that reflect internal mobilization without publicly acknowledging it, that reflects the transition from the managed competition posture to the pre-rupture decision posture. The prior context that makes the current pre-rupture configuration more dangerous than earlier near-threshold moments is the specific depletion of the resources that rupture prevention requires. Every managed competition phase consumes some portion of the trust, the communication architecture, the diplomatic creativity, and the mutual interest recognition that prevents pre-rupture compression from releasing into rupture. The current calm phase has been preceded by a managed competition that has been unusually depleting. Each previous near-threshold moment has required the deployment of significant portions of the prevention resource base, and the current pre-rupture configuration is being managed with a resource base that is more depleted than at any previous equivalent moment. Prevention tools that were adequate at previous pre-rupture moments are less adequate now, not because the current configuration is categorically different, but because the resource base available to deploy them has been reduced by the cumulative demands of the preceding managed competition phases. The media narrative is covering the calm phase as a diplomatic story. The ongoing negotiations, the humanitarian developments, the economic indicators of the conflict's costs, and the periodic violations of whatever framework is supposed to be maintaining the calm. Each of those stories is real, and what the media narrative is not doing is explaining why the calm itself, the reduction in visible intensity, is generating concern rather than reassurance in the analytical community that is most closely tracking the underlying structural indicators. The gap between the public narrative of managed stability and the expert assessment of pre-rupture compression is the analytical gap that this video is designed to close. Now let us build the power map, because the pre-rupture compression is being generated by specific actors whose behavior during the calm phase is producing the indicators that have shifted expert assessment. And understanding those actors and their real calculations is the foundation of understanding what the compression is building toward. Start with the primary actor whose internal decision-making has most directly produced the pre-rupture configuration. Publicly, this actor is projecting calm management, the posture of a party that is using the current phase to pursue its objectives through diplomatic and economic means rather than through the active competition whose costs have made the calm phase mutually acceptable. Strategically, what this actor is actually doing during the calm phase is executing a preparation sequence whose specific parameters reflect a decision that has been made about a course of action whose implementation the calm phase is designed to enable. The calm phase is not, for this actor, a period of reduced strategic activity. It is a period of maximum strategic activity conducted at reduced visibility, the specific combination of conditions that the pre-rupture compression mechanism produces. This actor's biggest constraint is the recognition window, the period, between the completion of its preparation sequence and the moment when the indicators that preparation generates become visible enough to produce an adequate response from the actors whose positions the preparation is designed to affect. Every element of the preparation's design reflects a calibration against that recognition window, and the pre-rupture configuration that the experts are starting to see is the product of a preparation that has advanced further through its timeline than the recognition window's closure has yet produced an adequate response to. Look at the United States, because Washington's engagement with the calm phase is the most consequential variable in whether the pre-rupture compression releases into rupture or is interrupted by a recognition-triggered response. Washington's analytical and policy apparatus is currently processing the calm phase through the intensity-based model that the context reset has identified as actively misleading in pre-rupture conditions. The model that treats reduced visible intensity as a signal of reduced danger rather than as a potential signal of pressure absorption into the pre-rupture configuration. That processing framework is producing policy responses calibrated to the managed competition posture rather Then to the pre-rupture posture that the structural indicators require. The biggest constraint on Washington is the institutional gap between the analytical community that is beginning to detect the pre-rupture configuration and the policy authorization process that would need to produce a response adequate to interrupt it. A gap that is being widened by the calm phase surface appearance of managed stability, which reduces the political urgency that drives the acceleration of the authorization process. Look at the regional actors whose positions are most directly affected by the pre-rupture compression. These actors have their own analytical frameworks and their own institutional incentives to read the structural indicators accurately, and several of them have reached the same pre-rupture assessment that the expert community is beginning to articulate their responses to that assessment. The specific adjustments in their own preparation postures, the specific communications they are initiating with external powers, and the specific economic and security arrangements they are pursuing are themselves secondary indicators that confirm the pre-rupture configuration's reality. The convergence of the primary indicators with the secondary confirmations from regional actors' behavioral responses is the specific analytical configuration that the most attentive experts find most alarming, because convergence across multiple independent analytical frameworks is the condition that most reliably distinguishes genuine pre-rupture signals from analytical overcaution. Look at Russia, because its role in the pre-rupture configuration is the dimension of the structural picture, whose accurate characterization is most consequential for understanding what the compression is building toward. Russia's behavior during the calm phase reflects a specific assessment of the pre-rupture configuration's trajectory, an assessment that has produced specific support decisions, specific capability and positioning choices, and specific diplomatic communications that are consistent with the posture of an actor that has concluded the pre-rupture compression will release rather than be interrupted, and that is positioning itself to manage the consequences of that release from the strongest possible position. Russia's assessment of the release probability is itself a significant secondary indicator, because Russia has consistently demonstrated a more accurate reading of the conflict's structural trajectory than the Western analytical consensus has produced at each previous near-threshold moment. Look at China, because its position relative to the pre-rupture configuration is the most structurally leveraged of any external actors, and the one that most directly determines whether the compression releases or is interrupted through the circuit breaker mechanism that this series has identified as the most viable prevention path. China has the economic leverage, the diplomatic relationships, and the strategic interest in avoiding the specific consequences that a pre-rupture release would produce for global energy and financial stability to function as the circuit breaker actor. Whether it chooses to deploy that capacity within the recognition window before the preparation sequence of the primary actor reaches its completion threshold is the single most consequential undecided question in the current pre-rupture configuration. That decision is being made in Beijing right now, with full awareness of the structural indicators that the expert community is starting to see, and with a strategic calculation whose resolution this video cannot predict, but whose direction the secondary signals from. Chinese diplomatic and economic behavior can partially illuminate. Now, let us turn to the structural facts, the hard, verifiable realities that explain why the calm phase is generating expert concern rather than reassurance, and what the pre-rupture compressions release would actually produce. Structural fact number 1. The closure of back-channel communication mechanisms during a calm phase is the single most reliable historical indicator of pre-rupture compression, and it is the indicator whose absence from the public monitoring framework creates the largest gap between expert assessment and public understanding. Back-channel communications are the pressure release mechanisms of managed competition. They allow actors to signal intentions, exchange red lines, and coordinate de-escalatory moves in ways that maintain the political deniability that public communications cannot preserve. When those channels close, the pressure that they were discharging accumulates without release. The closure is not always deliberate. It can result from the degradation of trust, the withdrawal of intermediaries, or the assessment by one actor that the communications are producing intelligence for its adversary without producing corresponding behavioral constraints. But regardless of its cause, the closure has the same structural consequence: pressure accumulation without release, which is the definition of pre-rupture compression. The systematic closure of the back-channel mechanisms that have functioned throughout this conflicts managed competition phase is the primary indicator that has driven the expert assessment shift. Structural fact number 2. The preparation signature that the experts are detecting reflects a specific operational timeline whose parameters are inconsistent with any contingency planning posture and consistent with implementation. Preparation for a specific course of action. Contingency planning preparation has a specific signature. It is distributed across multiple scenarios, sized for optionality rather than specific operational requirements, and does not have the timeline compression that implementation preparation produces. Implementation preparation has a different signature. It is concentrated on the specific resource and capability requirements of a specific operational objective, sized for operational sufficiency rather than scenario optionality, and has a timeline compression that reflects the specific operational window that the implementation is being prepared to exploit. The preparation signature currently being observed crosses the threshold from contingency planning to implementation preparation, which means that the course of action it is preparing for is not being considered. It has been decided upon, and the preparation is the implementation of that decision. Structural fact number 3, the decision-making behavior indicators that constitute the third component of the pre-rupture signal reflect a specific internal mobilization pattern that historical analysis associates with the final phase of major strategic decision implementation rather than with the deliberative phase of decision-making. The specific behavioral signatures and the compression of consultation cycles, the elevation of operational decision-making seniority, and the specific changes in public communication that reflect internal mobilization without public acknowledgement are the behavioral correlates of a political system that has resolved its internal deliberation and is organizing itself around execution. A political system in the execution organization phase is significantly less responsive to external deterrent signals than one in the deliberative phase. Because the deliberative phase is the period during which the cost-benefit calculation is still being formed and external signals can influence its formation, the execution organization phase is the period during which the calculation has been resolved and external signals must overcome the institutional momentum of an already organized execution effort to change the outcome. Structural fact number 4. The simultaneity of the 3 indicator categories, communication channel closure, implementation preparation signature, and execution organization behavior, is the specific configuration that historical analysis associates most reliably with the pre-rupture condition, as opposed to configurations in which 1 or 2 indicators are present while others are absent. When all 3 are present simultaneously, the pre-rupture configuration has reached a stage at which the precious release is being driven by structural momentum rather than by any individual actor's deliberate choice. The stage at which the decision to release has already effectively been made by the accumulated structure of the situation, even if no individual actor has formally made it in the specific terms that a deliberate choice would require. That structural momentum is what makes the current calm phase more dangerous than the active phases that preceded it, because the active phases were driven by deliberate choices that could be changed by changing the calculation of the actors making them, while the pre-rupture compression is driven by structural momentum that requires interrupting the structure rather than changing a calculation. Structural fact number 5. The resource base available for pre-rupture compression interruption is at its most depleted level in the current conflict's arc, which means that the prevention tools being deployed are less effective relative to the structural momentum being generated than they have been at any previous equivalent moment. The depletion is cumulative. Each previous near-threshold moment has required the expenditure of diplomatic capital, communication, architecture, functionality, economic leverage, and mutual interest recognition that cannot be replenished at the rate it has been consumed. The current pre-rupture configuration is the most advanced one this conflict has produced, and it is being managed with the most depleted prevention resource base this conflict has yet operated with. That combination, the most advanced pre-rupture configuration, and the most depleted prevention resource base, is the specific condition that makes the expert assessment shift from managed stability to pre-rupture concern, the analytically appropriate response to the current indicators. From this point, 3 scenarios are possible. Let me walk through each with the full precision this moment demands. Scenario A is the compression release path, the path on which the pre-rupture compression releases into rupture before an adequate intervention has been assembled, and in which the calm phase ends not through a gradual return to managed competition, but through a sudden and significant development whose scale and character exceed every projection that the intensity-based monitoring framework has produced. This scenario activates not through a single dramatic decision by any actor, but through the completion of the implementation preparation sequence to the point at which the operational window is open and the execution organization has reached the readiness threshold. The release in this scenario is not an escalation. In the conventional sense, it is a structural release of accumulated pressure that has a different character from the deliberate escalations of the managed competition phase because it is driven by structural momentum rather than by calculated decision and therefore does not respond to the deterrent signals and diplomatic interventions that would be adequate to manage a deliberate escalation. The specific early warning indicator of this scenario activating is a specific additional development in one of the three indicator categories, a development that reflects the completion of the preparation sequence's final phase, and that will be visible to close analytical observers before it produces a public event. Scenario B is the recognition-triggered interruption path, the path on which the expert assessment of the pre-rupture configuration reaches the decision makers with the authority to authorize an adequate intervention within the recognition window that still exists, and on which that intervention is assembled and deployed with sufficient speed and specificity to interrupt the structural momentum before the preparation sequence reaches its completion threshold. This scenario requires overcoming the institutional gap between the analytical community, that is, detecting the pre-rupture configuration, and the policy authorization process that would need to produce the intervention, an institutional gap that, if the calm phase's surface appearance of managed stability is actively widening, the specific intervention adequate to this scenario is not a deterrent signal within the established framework, because the execution organization phase that the decision-making behavior indicators reflect requires a higher intervention threshold than the deliberative phase, and deterrence tools are calibrated to address. It requires either a circuit breaker offer of the kind that China is structurally positioned to make, or an American response posture adjustment of sufficient scale and credibility to overcome the structural momentum of the execution organization that is already underway. Scenario C is the structural disruption wildcard, a development external to the pre-rupture configuration's current logic that changes the fundamental conditions of the situation in ways that interrupt the structural momentum before it reaches the release threshold. The most structurally plausible candidates for this role are a severe economic disruption in one of the key actors that changes the resource availability calculation underlying the implementation preparation, a sudden and significant political transition in a key decision-making actor that resets the execution organization that has accumulated around the resolved decision, or a third-party development of sufficient strategic magnitude to redirect the analytical and resource attention of the actors whose preparations are driving the pre-rupture compression. Each of these candidates is low probability in the specific time frame relevant to the current pre-rupture configuration. But each is higher probability than at any previous equivalent moment because the structural conditions of the current situation have elevated baseline volatility across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Let me now bring this directly home, because the pre-rupture compression and its potential release connect to your daily life through channels that are specific and deserve clear articulation. The energy and commodity channel is the most immediate. A pre-rupture release of the kind the indicators suggest would produce energy market consequences within hours, consequences that translate within days into the household energy cost increases, consumer price inflation, and supply chain disruptions that the current calm phase has been suppressing due to surface stability of the managed competition posture. The gap between current commodity market pricing and pre-rupture adjusted pricing is a direct measure of the financial exposure that every household, business, and financial institution carries, without recognizing it as connected to the structural indicators that the expert community is starting to track. The financial stability channel reflects the pre-rupture release's consequences for the global financial system, whose stability depends on the normal functioning of the economic relationships that the current conflict's managed competition phase has disrupted but not destroyed. A pre-rupture release that crosses into the structural rupture category would impose correlated risk repricing across multiple asset classes simultaneously. The specific category of financial market development that stress tests the global financial system's stability mechanisms most severely, and that produces consequences extending well beyond the direct financial exposures of the actors most closely connected to the conflict. The security and institutional channel is where the pre-rupture release's most durable consequences would be felt. The international institutional architecture that has been managing the conflict's pressures through the managed competition phase would be subjected to stresses that exceed its management parameters in the rupture scenario, producing institutional damage that persists through the post-rupture period and shapes the quality of international governance across every domain affected by the conflict's expansion. The democratic governance channel reflects the domestic political consequences of a pre-rupture release that occurs during a calm phase that has reduced public awareness of the danger consequences that include the specific accountability pressures generated by a significant development that the public conversation has not prepared the affected populations to understand or process, and managing those accountability pressures while simultaneously responding to the rupture's immediate consequences is the specific governance challenge that the pre-rupture release scenario imposes on every democratic government whose population has been operating within the intensity-based model that the calm phase has made dominant. My read on the current moment is this. The experts are starting to see a pre-rupture configuration whose three indicator categories have reached a combined threshold that makes the compression release scenario the most probable outcome if the recognition-triggered interruption is not assembled within the window that the preparation sequence's current completion state implies. That window is measured in weeks rather than months. The recognition-triggered interruption scenario remains achievable but requires an institutional response speed that the calm phase's surface appearance of managed stability is actively suppressing, and the circuit breaker wildcard, China's decision to deploy its leverage as a structural interruption mechanism, remains the most structurally elegant prevention path, but the one whose activation is most dependent on a strategic calculation, whose resolution is not yet determined. Short term. The most critical variable to watch is the pace of the preparation sequence's final phase, the specific developments in the three indicator categories that reflect the transition from preparation to implementation readiness, which will be visible to close analytical observers before they produce any public event that the standard monitoring framework would classify as significant. Long-term, the outcome of the current pre-rupture configuration will determine whether the calm phase is remembered as the period during which an expert-detected danger was recognized and interrupted in time, or as the period during which the most dangerous phase of the conflict was misread as its most stable one until the misreading became impossible to sustain. The calm phase might be the most dangerous. That is what the experts are starting to see. The indicators are real, the configuration is recognizable, and the gap between the expert assessment and the public conversation is the specific analytical vulnerability that makes the pre-rupture compression more dangerous than it would be if the danger were as visible as the active phases that preceded it. The analytical framework that makes the danger visible, the cross-domain synthesis of communication channel closure, implementation preparation signature, and execution organization behavior is what this channel exists to provide. Do not follow the apparent calm. Follow the structural indicators underneath it. Follow the communication channel status, the preparation signature evolution, and the decision-making behavior patterns that together constitute the clearest available picture of where the pressure that the calm phase is concealing is building toward and how much time remains before it finds its release. If you want to continue receiving this kind of structural, precise analysis before the events that confirm it have occurred, please like this video and subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell so the next analysis reaches you when it matters most. News changes fast, structures change slow. Know the difference, and that is precisely what we are here for.